Good morning. My name is Gale Yarborough, and this is a Sunday school lesson for June 15th. Happy Father's Day. I will start with prayer. Father, we thank you for giving us this day and giving us this message, and ask that we stay true to its word. Ask that you bless our church family, our leaders, and be with us. In Christ's name we pray, amen. So, Miss Cleo gave me this lesson, and it's called Abraham Makes an Offering. And one of the first things that came to mind is, of course, it's talking about Isaac, and when he's offering Isaac was going to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And my thought, especially of being a parent, is how in the world would anybody ever ask anybody to do that? And why in the world would anybody ever consider doing that? And for years, I've had trouble with this. I just didn't understand it. And with some study that I've done with different groups, it's made it a little bit clearer to me. But one of the songs that we sing that had really brought to mind what was going on, or just brought it a little bit clearer, was Standing on the Promises. And Abraham certainly stood on the promises of God that day, or during that situation. And also, I did a little study because trying to figure out how in the world Abraham could do this. I feel like we needed to know the character of Abraham and of God, and how their relationship was, how it started, how it developed, to get an understanding of how in the world this could be asked of Abraham, or Abraham at that time. So we know that just looking at the genealogy of Abraham, there was Noah, and he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we know that Jesus' line was supposed to come through the line of Shem. So Shem was a great, extra great grandfather of Abram. So we first see Abram in Genesis 11 when we know that Abram had already followed God, had been following God, but God appeared to Abram one day and promised to make his descendants into a great nation. And Abraham's part of the agreement, the only thing that he had to do was to obey God. That is all he had to do to receive all these riches and become the father of a great nation. And through testing, Abraham remained faithful to God. And we see Abraham's name in that genealogy list in Genesis 11. Then in Genesis 12, the Lord tells Abram to leave his family and his country and go to the land that he would show him. And then God made a covenant with Abraham. And it said, or actually it was Abram at this time, I think. Abraham moved out on faith. He went to Ur and to Haran and eventually to Canaan. But his covenant encompassed that God would make him a great nation, bless him, make your name great. You shall be a blessing. The one who curses you, I will curse, and you and all the families of the earth will be blessed. And that would be, of course, through Jesus. And that means not just the Jews, but to Gentiles, which we are. And so then I looked up the definition of covenant. And covenant is a sacred agreement or a pact between God and individuals or groups, establishing a relationship with promise and conditions. These covenants are more than just contracts. They are binding relationships where both parties make promises to each other and work toward a shared goal. And so like I said before, the only condition was that Abraham had to do what God wanted him to do, to obey God. So during the years, God continues to speak to Abram. So this wasn't just a one-time occurrence. He spoke to him, he appeared to him, he guided him, but they had a strong relationship. So when God spoke to him at Shechem, he said, to your descendants, I will give this land. And Abraham built an altar there, which he did several times. He built altars as remembrance. So God established the covenant with Abraham, telling them that he would found a great nation. Not only would this nation be blessed, God said, but the other nations of the world would be blessed through Abraham's descendants. Israel, the nation that would come from Abram, was to follow God and influence those with whom it came in contact. So that would be us. Through Abram's family tree, Jesus Christ was born to save humanity. Through Christ, people can have a personal relationship with God and be blessed beyond measure. So in learning about the relationship between God and Abraham, God didn't just speak to him that one time. He made that covenant, and he continued to speak with him and meet with him. Some examples are in Canaan. Well, just by the way, Canaan was where the focal point of most of the history of Israel is, as well as the rise of Christianity. And there are several different instances where God spoke and dealt with Abram. For example, Abram made mistakes. He passed his wife off as his sister, which truly she was his half-sister, but that was to save his life because two different kings at two different times desired her, and that was to save his life. But that's an example of he did not have enough trust. But God was building his faith through this testing, or proving, I like that word instead, proving of his faith and trust when he asked him to sacrifice Isaac. So Abram lost faith in God's protection even after all God had promised him. So he was human. So we see in Genesis 13:14, after Lot separates from Abram, the Lord told him to look all around the land, and all that he could see would belong to him and his descendants forever, and his descendants would be as many as the dust of the earth. So he's restating the covenant and showing Abraham the promise. In Genesis 15:4, God promises Abram will have an heir from his own body. And 15:6 is actually where Abram was actually saved. It says, then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned, and he, meaning God, reckoning it to him as righteousness. Although Abram had been demonstrating his faith through his actions, it was his belief in the Lord and not his actions that made Abraham right with God. I think that's very important. Genesis 15:12-15 talks about Abram fell into a deep sleep, and it was like the sleep that came upon Adam, that kind of a deep sleep. And during that, God tells Abram to know for certain that his descendants would be strangers in a foreign land. So this was almost like foretelling, because none of this had happened yet. They would be strangers in a foreign land, enslaved, oppressed for 400 years, that the nation would be judged, and they would come out with many possessions. Abraham would die in peace. The fourth generation would return here. And then in verse 18, God made the covenant with Abram. He had given this land to his descendants. So all this sounds familiar because this happened years and years later, but Abraham was told this. In Genesis 17:1, Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord actually appeared to Abram, stating that he would establish the covenant with Abram. In verse 15, he changes his name to Abraham. He repeated the covenant and said it was an everlasting covenant. So now he's repeated the covenant 3 times. So he hasn't just met with Abram that one time. He is developing a relationship with him. In verse 15 of chapter 17, Sarah's name was changed to Sarah. And verse 19, it says Sarah would have a son, not Ishmael. Ishmael was not going to be the son of the promise, but it was going to be Isaac. And verse 21, God states his covenant would be established with Isaac. And Genesis 18, it talks about the Lord appearing at Mamre, and it told him they would have a son the next year. So Abraham's obedience affected the history of the world. His decision to follow God set into motion the development of the nation that God would eventually use as his own when he visited earth himself. When Jesus came to earth, God's promise was fulfilled. That started actually with Abram. Through Abram, the entire world would be blessed. Other examples of God's meeting with Abraham spoke to God regarding Sodom and its destruction, and that's when he asked for, if a certain number were believers, would he still save this city? So they had developed a relationship, and Abram was being tested all this time and taught all this time to trust in God. And a little bit about Abraham and Isaac. When he was 100 years, of course, Isaac was born. Genesis 21:12 was, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. So he knew that Isaac was the son that would have the descendants that Isaac would live. Genesis 22:1, God tested Abraham not to trip him up and watch him fall, but to deepen his capacity to obey God and thus develop his character. God refines us through circumstances just like fire refines ore to extract precious metals. In Genesis 22:3, that morning Abraham began one of the greatest acts of obedience in recorded history. So over the years, he had learned many tough lessons about the importance of obeying God, and this time his obedience was prompt and complete. So why did God ask this proving of Abraham? So I'm going to read the lesson. We'll just read Genesis 22:1-14, and we'll go by verse and talk about each verse. And first, it had an introduction story, and I want to read that because I thought it was good. It says, this author is saying, as a competitive swimmer in high school, I had to practice every day. One wintry Friday evening, our coach assigned us to swim an extraordinarily long set. He didn't explain why he selected the gruesome workout, only that it would test, or grueling workout, only that it would test both our physical endurance and mental strength. Some teammates complained that the workout would upset their Friday night plans, so they refused to complete it. Others started the set but couldn't finish. Only 4 of us completed the workout, a completion rate of 10% of the team. When we arrived at practice the following Monday, our coach revealed that he had selected the team captains based on the workout from Friday night. He said that the 4 who finished, me and 3 others, had proven themselves committed and mentally tough enough to accept the responsibility of being team captains. Numerous examples from Scripture describe times when God tested his people's commitment. God challenges his people to remain faithful to and obey him even in the most difficult circumstances. This week's lesson will address one of the most famous examples of divine testing. While the Scriptures recognize Abraham as a man of faith, his was by no means a perfect faith. He demonstrated great faith in leaving his home in Ur, but by the end of the same chapter, he was telling his wife Sarah to lie and say she was his sister, and that was to save his life from those kings that desired her. Later, when Sarah failed to conceive, Abraham impregnated her maidservant Hagar rather than to seek the Lord's will. This created serious tension in Abraham's household. After God made it clear to Abraham that Sarah would give him a son, and it would be Sarah that would give him a son, Abraham handed over her to a pagan king, failing once again to trust God. Despite all this, God remained faithful to Abraham and Sarah. He delivered them from several powerful kings. He watched over their circumstances, including Lot, which we talked about, Hagar and Ishmael, who was Hagar's son, another son of Abraham. And God provided the son of promise, which was Isaac, for whom Abraham and Sarah had been waiting. Still, by the time we get to Genesis 22, we are left wondering whether God would grow impatient. Abraham was a man of spiritual highs and lows. His faith was strong but inconsistent. The reader is left wondering who the real Abraham is. Perhaps Abraham was wondering the same thing. Was he still the man of great faith who left Ur behind to go to an unknown land, or had years of wandering taking their toll on his faith? Anyway, we're going to start reading verse by verse, and it's Genesis 22, verse 1-2. And it came to pass after these things, which meaning it had been a certain passage of time, that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And that's the first of 3 times that he says, Behold, here I am. We do not know how much time had passed, but Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And looking at different things, it looks like maybe Isaac was probably around 13 years old. The Hebrew word translated as tempt is also translated as prove, and I do like that a little bit more in numerous instances, and that is the sense here. God does not tempt anyone to sin, as we see in James 1:13. Instead, the idea in this verse is that of proving one's faith through testing. Hebrews supports this by saying that Abraham was tried. So in verse 2 it says, And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. This verse is talking about Isaac as being the only son of Abraham, which we know that through Hagar, the maidservant, that he did have another son, Ishmael, not Ishmael, Ishmael, but he was not the son of promise. There is only one son of promise to Abraham, and that was the son Isaac. Therefore, it's most startling to read that God asked Abraham to sacrifice the child of promise. This request is undoubtedly what Abraham finds most disturbing, as would any of us. God had spoken to Abraham many times, often to reiterate covenant promises, and I read at least 3 times that he reiterated the promises to make him a great nation with countless descendants. The command, Take now thy son, and offer him there for a burnt offering, seems to threaten these promises. Abraham is not only giving up someone he loves, but also cutting off the only way he sees possible to beget offspring. The law of Moses prohibited human sacrifice, even though Moses certainly was many years after Abraham. We can see God's character in that in the Old Testament it chastised God's people for breaking commandments. But Abraham lived 5 centuries or so before the giving of the law of Moses, so human sacrifice to pagan gods was not unheard of in the ancient Near East. Moriah is mentioned also, the place that they were to go. It's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible in 2 Corinthians or Chronicles 3:1. That passage informs us that centuries after Abraham, King Solomon would build the temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. The location where God asked Abraham to offer his son is the same place where the people will later sacrifice their offerings, and very close to where God will offer up his own son, Jesus. How ironic. And then another story that was included in the lesson, which was good. It talks about testing and the value of testing, and it talks about the last 100 years of the automobile usage has led to several safety improvements. By one estimate, traffic fatalities in 1923 in the United States occurred at a rate of 18.65 deaths per 100 million miles traveled. In 2021, that rate had dropped to 1.5 deaths per 100 million miles traveled. What made the difference? Better cars. They tested cars, they had crash dummies, they tested our airbags, they tested seat belts, and so the purpose of testing is to discover strengths and weaknesses. Trusting God helps us build on the former and minimize the effects of the latter. Even if we don't understand why we're being tested, this was the case for Abraham. So we look further into the text, and it's Genesis chapter 22 again, verses 3 through 10. Verse 3, Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. Well, we are not told that Abraham said anything in response to God's command. There's no haggling with God, no bargaining with God. Abraham wasted no time in carrying out his assignment. His actions speak for themselves as he rose early that next day to begin the trip. The journey required 2 young male servants to help carry things. He probably needed their help in handling the logistics of getting there, clothing, bedding, things that required for the trip, animals, or pack animals. This verse reveals Abraham's faithfulness and obedience to God. When God initially called him from Haran, Abraham followed in hopes of receiving the promises. Now Abraham followed God's lead in full awareness that he might lose his son and thereby the promises of God. Verse 4, then on the 3rd day, so it was about 50 miles away from where he started, and it took 3 days to get there, so he had a lot of time to think, I imagine. If we assume that Abraham's point of departure is Beersheba, according to Genesis 21, then the trip to Moriah is one of about 50 miles and a 3-day journey. In building such a time into this test, God made sure that Abraham's compliance would not be an impulsive act. Abraham's faith was tested in the crucible of time. Verse 5, Abraham said unto his young men, the 2 that he brought with him, Abide here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder, like we Southerners talk, and worship and come again to you. So Abraham's saying to the young men, and in hearing of his son Isaac, we're going to come back to you. Abraham needed the aid of the young men, as we're talking, to reach this point. But now he must leave them behind. And Abraham's statement, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you, injects irony and ambiguity into the narrative. In Hebrews 11, which is the faith chapter, this offers helpful commentary in stating that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son because he believed that God could bring him back from the dead. And in that case, we can read Abraham's words in the verse before us as proof of his trust in God's promises. Verse 6, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hands and a knife, and they went both of them together. The narrative as we have it provides minimum details. It says nothing about the emotional state of Abraham or Isaac. We don't know if Abraham was tearful or if he was reticent or if Isaac was talking and chattering about what are we doing here. We know nothing of how Abram might have felt as he laid the wood of the burnt offering on the back of his son, whose body may soon be consumed. It's noteworthy that Jesus also carried on his back the wood that was his own cross to Golgotha, and as we stated before, in this same area. Verse 7, and Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, my father, and he said, here am I. That's the second time that has been spoken. My son, here am I, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for burnt offering? At last we hear from Isaac, and his address draws the second of the three, here am I. This verse indicates that Abraham has not yet told Isaac what is about to happen. Isaac's question is to be expected. He and his father have all the elements for a sacrificial offering, except for the sacrificial animal himself. And Abraham, verse 8, And Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. Some students of the text think that Abraham intended to mislead Isaac to avoid scaring him. A better idea is that Abraham was so convinced by God's provision that he was confident in God's miraculous provision to provide a lamb for a burnt offering. Abraham likely knew that God's promise does not depend on human planning, so he waited expectantly for God to provide. Verse 9, and they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. The text again does not disclose the age of Isaac. He might have been a child, but some later Jewish interpretations of this text believe that he was a grown and past the age of 13. The basis for this interpretation is that Isaac willingly submitted to being sacrificed. God's request of Abraham might seem to be less problematic if Isaac himself volunteered to die. The altar Abraham built may be no more than a simple pile of rocks. The wood was laid on top of the rocks, and the offering was on top of the wood. For Abraham to bind Isaac his son may not be a simple matter, however, if the lad resisted. But the text gives no indication that he resisted. The succinct narration emphasizes Abraham's obedience. He showed commitment to God by completing the procedures to sacrifice his son. Verse 10, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay him. No spoken words are recorded, but it's easy to conjecture what is going through the minds of both father and son. The level of Abraham's anguish probably matches the level of Isaac's terror. Only God's intervention can stop things now. So we go to verse 11. The angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here am I. This verse provides the story's climax, God's intervention through the angel of the Lord. This title, the angel of the Lord, is a designation given to God's angelical beings who often relay the words of God. In the verse before us, the angel does not appear to Abraham. Instead, the angel speaks to Abraham from heaven. For the third and final time in this story, Abraham responds, "Here am I." Abraham is interrupted just as he is about to carry out the sacrifice commanded of him. The twofold calling of Abraham, Abraham carries a sense of urgency. The scene is similar to what later occurs at the burning bush with Moses. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. But then God is said to be the one who calls to Moses from the bush. It is clear that the angel represents divine authority. Verse 12, "And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me." The angel ordered Abraham to halt, thus preventing any physical harm to Isaac. The angel reveals the rationale for God's request to test whether Abraham was willing to give up his only son out of obedience to God. These words tell us that Abraham has indeed passed the test. In essence, God asked him, "Do you trust me and me alone to fulfill my promises to you?" All the promises, giving him a great land, giving him riches, giving him animals, giving him descendants. Are you willing to give up all control and place your entire future into my hands? The answer to both the questions is a resounding yes. No other feat could demonstrate with such certainty Abraham's faith in God alone to fulfill his promise. Isaac is not merely his only son. Isaac was Abraham's only chance to secure future promises. And in raising the knife, Abraham boldly declared his conviction that God is his only hope. With that unspoken confession of faith, he received his son back as though from the dead. And we should not misinterpret the phrase, "thou fearest." God is not glad that Abraham was afraid of him. Instead, fear is another way to express worship. And a lot of times, if we just put in there, instead of the word fear, put reverence, or it's a reverence. That's the type of fear, it is a reverence. Instead, fear is another way to express God's worship. It signifies that Abraham understood that his son and thus his future belonged to God. Abraham's obedience echoes David's later testimony of the Lord. "For as the heaven is high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward them that fear or reverence him." The will of God was the driving force in Abraham's life. God was his ultimate motivation. Abraham's actions reveal the heart of true worship. God values obedience over sacrifice. And Abraham was certainly obedient. So verse 13, "And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son." Centuries after Abraham, the law of Moses would prescribe the use of a ram for sacrificial offerings and in ordination proceedings. God did indeed provide the sacrifice. The ram was not provided when Abraham began his 3-day journey, along the journey, or at the foot of Mount Moriah. It was provided only after Abraham demonstrated his willingness to go all the way in carrying out God's instructions. The mention of Abraham's eyes is important when it talks about Abraham lifted up his eyes. The mention of Abraham's eyes is important given what occurs in the following verse. "And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen." God faithfully provided for Abraham. As a result, the man names the location Jehovah-Jireh, which means the Lord will see or the Lord will provide. Abraham fully understood that the one true God always sees that his people are provided for. It is worth noting that Abraham does not name the place Isaac is spared or a father is relieved. This account has been about God's faithfulness and whether Abraham truly believes that God will keep his promises, and indeed God is faithful, and Abraham truly believed. So in conclusion, just a couple of notes. Tests revealed the preparation of the one tested. Some tests also expose the character of the person being tested. God's testing of Abraham in today's scripture exposed the man's trust, his loyalty, and his devotion. It provided the authenticity of his faith, the faith for which God pronounced Abraham righteous. The testing of Abraham also revealed God's faithfulness and promises to his people. God preserved the life of Isaac and therefore reiterated his promises to multiply Abraham's descendants and bless all nations. God's people would continue to face tests and trials. Not all these trials will be from God in the same manner as Abraham's test. Trials prove the strength and sincerity of our faith. While we may never hear a voice from God at the test's conclusion, we can be confident God will be with us in our trials as we grow in faith, perseverance, and maturity. Just a couple more things that I had found. God did not want Isaac to die, but he wanted Abraham to sacrifice Isaac in his heart so that it would be clear that Abraham loved God more than he loved his promised and long-awaited son. God was testing Abraham. The purpose of testing, as we talked about, is the strengthening of our character and deepening of our commitment to God in his perfect timing. Through this difficult experience, Abraham strengthened his commitment to obey God, and he also learned about God's ability to provide. And there is a parallel between the ram offered in the altar and a substitute for Isaac, and Christ offered on the cross as a substitute for us. Maybe God knew Abraham would do it, and maybe Abraham knew God wouldn't let him. My light bulb moment in all this story is Abraham knew through his relationship, his true relationship with God, and trusted that Isaac was the promise. He trusted the promise. He trusted that Isaac was the promise. As he was told through his relationship with God, he'd seen how he had led him the whole way through to this point. And he had never left him. He had never failed him, even though Abraham had certainly failed God from time to time. He trusted that Isaac was the promise and nothing would happen to him. He would not die because he had faith and believed in God. Thank you for coming to our lesson today. Hope you have a good day.